Steve and Pauline Richards' psychosystems analysis represents the new paradigm of psychotherapy. At its heart is their framework of informational monism and superposition theory, first codified by them in 1988. Knowing these two principles, informational monism and superposition theory, allows you to have a field understanding of human nature, one that is both revolutionary and liberating in equal measure. To demonstrate them in action, let's first of all turn our attention back to Jung. If you recall, Jung's definition of the ego was that it was a specialized complex which formed the center of the field of consciousness. Steve and Pauline accept Jung's proposal, but refine that field nature to include a much wider distribution of representational states that are superpositioned with and between one another infodynamically. These representational states include the melanumber, the persona, the self-image, the self-concept, the complex field, the dream ego, and more. We will explore each of these as we progress, but before we do, we need first of all to define field. Steve does so as such, quote, "An informational field is a heterogeneous field of informational states that are connected by association to one another. These different informational states can exchange energy and information within and between themselves, and so change, through such interaction, their composition, and both their representational and associative states. For example, the field of a complex can be represented by stretching its effects over the biopsychosocial stack, thereby revealing its field nature at and between all affected levels. The waveform on screen shows exactly this: the distributed informational field of a complex stretched over the biopsychosocial stack. The waveform moves and pulses, showing a dynamic shifting of how that complex represents itself through different informational states, namely different subdivisions of biology, psychology, and the psychosocial. Where there's more of a spike in the waveform, there's a greater density of complex activity operating at that resolution. This schema gives us a good foundation for modelling how a single psychodynamic, in this case a complex, could operate in somebody's life. It will be psychological, so having representation in cognition or affects, for example. Or it could be so-called psychosomatic, so that is operating within psychology and biology at the same time in a clinical presentation. If this is the case, then Rossi's transduction pathways are certainly implicated to mediate this. So too, it is very likely to have noticeable psychosocial representation as well, such as in personal relationships. Regardless of what we notice about a complex, however, complexes will always have representation at all of these levels. All of them. Some levels, of course, are more immediately relevant, clinically or for personal development, but we must understand that complexes, indeed any psychodynamic, or really infodynamic, always has representation as an informational field across the entirety of the biopsychosocial stack, superpositioned across all of these different informational states. Knowing this, we can now zoom into the resolution of the ego as modelled by Steve and Pauline. Remember, everything that you're about to see is always superpositioned across the biopsychosocial stack, but we need to adopt an intra-ego view for illustration. Everything in this section is a lightly copy-edited version of words written by Steve Richards. Let's begin with the complex field. The complex field is that field of partitioned systematized information that forms in response to the ego's lifespan developmental experience. There are three taxa of complex within this field, all of which form through Jungian dissociation and regulating infodynamics. The first is ego non-aligned complexes, the second are ego-aligned complexes, and the third are ego-identified with complexes. All of these taxa may exchange energy, so libido, whether that be metabolic or instinctive, and information, so that is infodynamics, within and between themselves, either to internally regulate the content of their relational field, or in response to meta-regulation by various homeostatic processes. In this way, they may change their taxa in relation to the ego field. So, for example, moving from identified to aligned. You can see this in the schema on screen. All of the complexes, regardless of taxa, are dynamic. They're always under the regulating influence of whole field homeostasis. As they fade out from view, they exert less of a direct influence on the field of the ego. As they fade back in again and move more into focus, they're exerting a greater influence. All are in association to one another, as shown by them moving closer and further away from each other. The ontology of complexes always concerns adaptive responses to internal and external challenges along the lifespan. Internal pressure arises from the genome as Panksepian drives and timed release meta-instincts. External pressure is anticipated by both Panksepian and meta-instincts. The result of this is complexes as variously systematized into optimal, suboptimal, or maladaptive fields of association. Typically, complexes form around key relationships and anticipated scenarios for adaptive challenges. Steve and Pauline differ from Jung on this in that they consider meta-instinctive fields and Panksepian drive pressure, rather than archetypes, to be the underlying organizing factor through which complexes form. So the ego partitions under this pressure and devolves functional responsibility to its partitioned subsets, that is, to ego states that form as complexes for a specific devolved purpose. In this, they have an adaptive evolutionary advantage, which comes at the cost of potential neurosis, or severe mental illness. Not all complexes are maladaptive. Those that are not may simply be inertial, such as in having been long ago consolidated into long-term memory, and function as non-declarative learning, or they're effectively dormant. Others that are positive in adaptive function may be held in tacit or implicit identification with the self-image. We'll discuss this in a moment. In such cases, these positive ego-identified with complexes act appropriately through the ego's action in the world and its receptivity to inner experience. Now let's add another element to our schema, the self-concept. The self-concept field is that field of systematized information which extends back along the individual's timeline, containing every subjective experience that has ever been identified with by that individual as being them, or involving them relationally. This includes all biopsychosocial states that have ever been associated to the ego's developing sense of identified with reflexivity. Biopsychosocial states are configurations within the objective waveform of the Platonic field that also include all subjective ego field states of the subjective waveform of the ego. So an ego field state, or simply an ego state, represents a transitory or a sustained configuration of the ego field, sufficient to cause either partitioning into a Geneian complex, thereby generating the complex's self-directed autonomy, or of forming a persistent representation of itself which is incorporated into the self-image, as the dynamic focus of the self-concept field. Those autonomous complexes that the ego identifies with form that part of the complex field incorporated into the field of the self-concept, and its focus, the self-image. The majority of the contents of the self-concept field are consolidated into long-term memory, shown in the background by that very dark but still dynamic, moving series of complexes. And these are unavailable for recall by the ego's conscious will or intention, but they are subject to psychodynamic and field infodynamic processes that may introduce or return them into association to the ego, either in whole or in part, and are capable of activation by directed homeostasis. We've mentioned the self-image a couple of times so far. The self-image field, shown in the centre as a red nucleus of associations that, if you watch them really closely, do not fade away into the background. This is the internal mirror that is subjectively experienced as the representation of personal identity. In effect, this is the ego's internal persona. It reflects back the ego's referent understanding of itself to itself. It is both tacit and implicit, requiring either direct internal checking through the Miller number in order to become explicit, or for its representation to emerge autonomously into the Miller number. So the self-image is unconscious to reflexive awareness unless it's either deliberately accessed or it intrudes autonomously. The self-image can update itself continuously, but it will have a nucleus of identified with self-referent information. Again, that's the red nucleus in the centre of the screen, drawn from the continuity of the field of the self-concept over the timeline of the individual's ongoing lifespan development. It functions as the defining focus of the field of the self-concept, when the ego field reflexively examines itself. As you can see from the schema we've been building on screen, each of these field informational states that we've discussed, which define the ego, are all superpositioned with each other. This is really important to remember, as we're about to move on to speaking about so-called specialized complexes. They are all their own discrete infodynamic, but they always draw their material and their contents from everything that we've just discussed. So the complexes and the sustained, persistent biopsychosocial states of the ego. So if we discuss firstly the persona field, it is its own discrete infodynamic. We can speak of a persona as its own entity. However, the persona field is always superpositioned with the self-concept, the self-image, and the three taxa of Jungian complex, whether they be incorporated into the self-concept and self-image or not. So its informational contents, the contents of the persona, is simultaneously in, that is, superpositioned with, the persona field, and also the other elements previously described. The same is true of the alter ego, the moral complex, the dream ego, and the Miller number, which we're about to discuss. So the persona field is the dynamic two-way interface between the individual organism and any two-person and above relational interaction, extending out into the collective socio-cultural and natural environments. Unlike in Jung's model, the persona field is not seen as something unreal or only consciously constructed as an ideal mask, hence the name persona. Rather, it is a component of the whole ego field that has first evolved and then functionally adapted as the psychosocial interface between the individual and others. The specialized complexes called the alter ego and the moral complex, which are analogous to some extent with Jung's shadow and Freud's superego, respectively, arise as a necessary ontological consequence of the development of the ego field. Each is a field of systematized information that relates homeostatically to the ego field. We've spoken on both of these complexes at great length in other videos on this channel. Then we have the dream ego. This is the representational form and reflexive experience of the self-image, as that has transitioned from the waking ego, so normal state, and into the dream process. Both waking and dream ego states share the self-concept and its foci of the self-image. Likewise, they share the same ego-identified with complexes. Remember, those are the green circles on screen and the red nucleus of the self-image, which, being associated with the self-concept and its self-image, are necessarily drawn into the narrative structure of the dream state. We've discussed this at great length in recent IPSA professional training seminars, and we will be making more videos on this for Jung to live by soon. The last informational state of the ego we need to discuss is our ongoing centre of awareness, what Janet and Jung called the centre of the field of consciousness, and Freud the periphery of the ego. In Steve and Pauline's psychosystems analysis, the equivalent is the Miller number field. This is our ongoing immediate conscious awareness. It has an informational processing capacity of 7 ± 2 chunks of information. Rather than being the centre of the ego, the Miller number field is instead a focused interface between the extended inner and outer domains of our subjective waveform, which is the dynamic collapse of the wider objective waveform into our reflexive consciousness. The inner domain refers to interoception and the intrapsychic, and the outer domain refers to the exteroceptive and our social environment. The mediating system of information processing between inner and outer experience has evolved to deal with the demands of in-the-moment ongoing adaptation, including the organising of behaviour towards meeting our internal and external homeostatic needs, where meeting such needs are beyond an internal metabolic level of self-regulation. In humans, the Miller number is a very ancient phylogenetic system whose informational carrying capacities and representational configurations have been built upon highly adaptive and conserved functions from the remote past. Indeed, in their simplest form, right back to single-cell organisms. So the Miller number configures the immediate adaptive representational state of the ego, but it is not the centre of the ego's field. In fact, there is no centre to the ego's field per se, as you can see from the schema on screen. So too, as we've discussed, Jung spoke of complexes as having an archetypal core. In psychosystems analysis, Jungian complexes have a meta-instinctive core, but really, said core opens up into an entire field of informational representation. In summary, the ego is an emergent field, released ontologically in relationship to innate anticipations and experience. Its field is distributed into several superpositioned subfields: the Miller number, the persona, the self-image, the self-concept, the complex field, and the dream ego. The ego is therefore not localized into a single place in the brain, although the brain's evolutionary development does map the integrated and superpositioned field nature of the ego, as this is imminent with the development of the brain at the neurophysiological level. This means that the ego is simultaneously all of its superpositioned subfields, all of those elements discussed so far, as these are dynamically distributed informationally and materially. Our everyday understanding of the ego as being conscious and being the subjective I that experiences moment-by-moment reflexive awareness is therefore only a partial focal collapse of its overall field. Informational monism and superpositioning define the emergent field of the ego. In contrast to consciousness simply being defined as our ongoing sense of awareness, psychosystems analysis defines consciousness to be a complexity of information that represents itself to itself, and then represents itself to other complexities of information. This baseline definition is derived from informational monism and superposition theory, which is a Platonic ontological modelling of consciousness as such, and is a priori to the collapse of consciousness into human ego consciousness. So, taken overall, consciousness is a dynamic informational field phenomenon that exists in many simultaneous superpositioned states, like those we've discussed so far, with each state being a nodal point of collapse of representation of consciousness, with that collapse defining any given state or organised system as being that state or system, and the intra or inter-relational fields within and between them. For the ego, the change in relative state of consciousness, both within and between the nodal points of this field, defines the relative valency of the information in relation to our subjective reflexivity. That is, to our ongoing awareness, both of our continuity of personal identity and how this changes over time. Updating can be either or both progressive and retrogressive under the influence of biopsychosocial field pressure. This includes genomic, instinctive, developmental, intrapsychic, social, and environmental factors. There's one more type of informational state to discuss, and that's the qualia of consciousness. The qualia of consciousness are the ontological and evolutionary qualia of consciousness shown on this schema. All are superpositioned with each other, meaning that each is immanent with the same fundamental information present in all of them. As qualia of consciousness specifically, each represents a type of consciousness. The most fundamental is intuition as ground state field consciousness. Intuition superpositions itself into the other four qualia, up through interoceptive and exteroceptive. These are analogous to Jung's introverted and extroverted sensing functions, respectively, and they're labelled on this schema as somatic and sensory. Next up, more recently evolved, is affect, as defined specifically by affective neuroscience and neuropsychoanalysis as a priori to cognition, and then up to cognition itself, as being the most recently evolved cognitive function, analogous to both of Jung's feeling and thinking functions. Feeling for Jung was an affect-toned, rational function, rather than a state of pure affect. In psychosystems analysis, thus, the Jungian feeling function is cognitive, but with a receptivity to superpositioned affect, which is absent in pure thinking, as Jung models that to be. The ego represents its experience of itself and the extended internal and external environments through any and all of the post-intuitive qualia of consciousness, so cognition, affect, sensation, and somatic. Under normal conditions, intuition can't represent itself as itself. It must collapse into one or more of the other representational qualia. However, under the special conditions of advanced dissociative training and practice, Eastern and Western traditions, it is possible to escape the limitations of informational collapse into the post-intuitive qualia of ego consciousness. This advanced dissociative experience also increases the bandwidth of the Miller number internally. Steve and Pauline explain exactly how to do this, using their neurohypnoanalysis and psychosystems analysis as part of professional training at IPSA, including with live demonstrations. For somebody dealing with a trauma-induced or trauma-informed complex, this schema represents both the immediate phenomenological felt problem and one of its solutions. Remembering that complexes are always biopsychosocial, they will always have representation in all of the post-intuitive qualia of consciousness. Usually someone is only aware of one or two, due to the limited processing capacity of the Miller number, such as racing cognition or a surge in affect. Or, if so-called psychosomatic, then distressing representation in sensation or somatic. Regardless of the in-the-moment qualia configuration of the subjective waveform of the ego, however, the other qualia, including ground state intuition, are always superpositioned with it, merely outside of Miller number awareness. Through healthy dissociation, progressively down through the qualia of consciousness, it is absolutely possible to configure the ego field to be receptive to those other informational fields, metaphorically deeper than the ego. This is represented by the ancestral psyche, the domain of the meta-instincts, superpositioned very closely with the genome and its lifespan development intentionality. This and other dissociative methods taught by Steve and Pauline bypasses complexes completely, without any need to confront them, nor any need to feel an unpleasant surge of affect. Metaphorically, going straight to the genome and its metafields of regulation and intentionality is how true healing change can arise.